Hey folks, I wanted to get an updated version of my Freezing Pulse Totem build out to people in time before League starts, so hopefully it's not going to be anywhere near as long as the last one. It's actually pretty late here, as you can see. It's been a long day trying to get the guides updated and stuff, but I figured I have time to record both of these and get them uploaded so people can start seeing them tomorrow. Or later today, rather. The short version is that both Freezing Pulse and Holy Flame Totem actually just wound up getting buffed by the 3.8 changes. That kind of surprised me. I wasn't really expecting any buffs or nerfs. I thought maybe Soul Mantle would get changed, but what actually happened is, well, a number of things, right? So let's talk about what happened with the passive tree first. The main thing that happened here in the passive tree for the Hierophant is this Divine Guidance change, which is the 150 flat mana that used to be on this node got replaced by 30% increased maximum mana, which is actually just a tiny nerf, right? I think this node taken in isolation, I lost about 150 mana from that change. Or like, it's actually more like 110, sorry. It's quite late. But it's pretty small. The other thing, though, they added this Transfiguration of Mind effect, which didn't have a name until the tree data was posted. But what it does is it allows increases to maximum mana to also apply to damage at 30% of their value. So what that means is the 206% increased mana we have coming from the tree also grants us it'd be 61% damage in this case, so 30% of 206 gets added as free damage, which obviously didn't exist before. So right out of the gate, we gained about 8% total damage from that change. We lost only like 100 total mana, but as you can see, we didn't lose mana overall because of the second change, which was changes to some mana notables. They have two new mana wheels here, and both of them wound up being really good. And as you can see in the 95 version of the tree, we wind up with both wheels entirely. The first one happens to be pretty close to the Templar start. It's called Arcane Capacitor. The notable is 15% max mana, so it's slightly weaker in raw mana than most of the mana notables. Usually you'll get an average about 20% for a mana notable. This one's only 15, but it also has 10% increased effect of Arcane Surge on you per 200 mana spent recently, up to 50%. Now, we have pretty high mana costs in this build, but I wouldn't say that we cast super frequently, right, compared to other builds. So, for the purposes of path of building, I'm pretty much just assuming that we're getting the minimum effect out of this. There's also another 10% increased effect of Arcane Surge here. So in total, we, at a minimum, really, we're going to get 20% increased effect of Arcane Surge at all times. And I'm just simulating that in the Arcane Surge gem itself. Normally, we could afford to run like a 18 here. That's still within 2 casts of Frostbite. And I'm just bumping it up from 18 to 24, which is about 20% more effective. So that winds up being like a 20,000-ish DPS increase in this setup. Not a ton, but remember the mana that we're getting feeds into damage, so investing into mana has gained a little bit more opportunity cost. The other wheel, though, is definitely the star of the show here. This is a 5-point wheel, and you can come at it from either side. We're already connected here, so this was another one. We were connected to both of them. It was really convenient. The first one, the closer one, is 6% chance to block spell damage, the same 15% increased max mana, and then 1% increased mana regen per 1% chance to block spell damage. Because this minor also has 2%, we wind up with about 20% spell block, so we'll get 20% mana regen from that. And then a 10% mana minor, which is pretty good. These two nodes here, though, this is a 10% spell damage, 5% mana minor, and then Prodigal Perfection, which is another 10% spell damage, 15% max mana, and then 2% spell damage for 100 max mana up to a cap of 40%. So that only takes 2,000 mana to cap out, which we'll easily clear. So we're going to get 60% spell damage from just these two nodes here. And then 50% mana from the whole wheel, which obviously converts into another 10%, or closer to like 16.5% total damage, right? I'm already assuming the whole 61% from the total, but it just sort of has to do with the opportunity cost of taking mana in the first place. And basically to pay for these nodes, these changes, we've basically backed out of Arcane Swiftness. This is also a pretty good node, and if you have the mana ratio right, you probably want to come back into this as soon as you can. But it winds up being a worthwhile trade, basically. All told, the passive tree doesn't look very different. We don't have to make any actual routing adjustments because the new nodes are actually connected to us. We don't actually lose any total mana, really. We just gain about 8% damage. So that's cool. What else changed? So in terms of gear, the main thing to talk about, we aren't going to be, at least as far as I can tell, equipping any new items. What has changed gear-wise is that there's a new affix that's going to be on one-handed weapons and pure intelligence shields, which will be able to get +1 to all cold skill gems, and this will be a global affix, so it can be on your weapon and it'll apply to all the cold gems on your entire character. Now, it's kind of complicated to evaluate this for the weapon, because I'm pretty sure this is going to be a prefix, and if you've ever crafted in this game, you know that it can be really tricky to get 2 prefixes on a base, because what it implies is that you start with a magic base and you alt spam it until you hit either this elemental damage is extra chaos or +1 to all cold skills, and then hopefully you either didn't get a suffix when you did that, or the suffix is really good, like a tier 1 cast speed or a tier 1 crit multi or something. And then you have to regal it, and when you regal, you have to immediately hit the other affix, right? So if we had 19% elemental damage as when we started, we'd have to immediately regal into +1 to all cold. And if you didn't, you were kind of like screwed, right? You would have to annul twice and hope you just get back down to elemental damage as extra chaos, or you just have to start over. And even if you did, like even when you do hit elemental damage as extra chaos and +1 to all cold, you probably still have a suffix that's not good. So you would have to risk annulling it anyway, and you've got only a 1 in 3 chance to get the suffix off. There's a 2 in 3 chance you wind up fucking the item up, or at least reducing you to a 50-50 on another annulment orb, which aren't cheap, to hopefully take the suffix off and leave you with 1 good prefix. I guess ultimately what's going to happen, like the actual impact of this on the weapon, is that we have 1 more affix that we can roll that's basically on par with this elemental damage as extra chaos. So you can get that, or +1 to all cold skill gems, and still have a base that's worth multi-modding. So there's like a little bit more chance we're going to get a multi-mod worthy weapon, which is a good thing. But the odds that you're actually going to get a scepter that has both of those and you can multi-mod, we'd probably trade the cold damage to spells, assuming it's a prefix. It's basically 0, right? I don't think it's going to matter how much currency you have. It's going to be exceedingly rare. If you can get it though, you know, God bless, right? However, this +1 to all cold skills can roll on a pure int shield, and that's where we're really going to want to chase it, because right now, especially towards the league start, your first goal is just to kind of get a shaper shield and get +1 maximum totems on it and then craft life on it. That +1 max number of summon totems is not a rare affix. It's actually pretty common, and so the chances of getting a shield that has totems and +1 to all cold skills is way better, right? And you won't really, I think, in a lot of cases need to even alt spam this. I think Chaos Spam is going to be a totally reasonable path to a shield that has both of those. Or maybe, you know, using essence crafting with life essences or something. Basically, it's going to be a lot more reasonable to do this on a shield. And if we do land that, we can see that we'd get another 8-ish% damage out of 1 rank of Freezing Pulse. This new affix, by the way, doesn't affect anything but active skill gems. So like it wouldn't, even though Cold Pen is a cold gem, they're support gems and they are ignored. So it's basically just going to be for Freezing Pulse. Technically it would also be for Cold Snap and like Frost Bomb, but the levels of those skills actually don't matter to us. But getting another 8% total damage would be great. And I think it's going to be a lot more, you know, feasible. So just between, if you do that, and between the Divine Guidance change, this build's basically just going to get a free, well, almost free, 15% more damage than it did in 3.7, with absolutely no other changes necessary. I didn't think the build needed that for sure, but I'm not going to look a gift horse in the mouth, I guess. Otherwise, nothing really is going to change gear-wise. I suppose the only thing you could say is that the new anointing mechanic that's going to be in the Blight League is going to affect our amulets, right? It's not going to affect the choice of our amulet, the actual gear piece, but we're going to be able to enchant our amulet with these oils that drop from the Blight mechanic. And when you do that to an amulet, the outcome is that you get 1 free notable allocated on the passive tree. And what gets allocated depends on like what oils you put into the system. We have no idea currently like how rare some of the harder to get oils are, or like you know, how easy it is basically going to be to get some of these notables. But there are some pretty good choices here. Originally I was going to have, you know, Crusader on that list. There are 13 notables that you see, these notables that seem like they aren't connected to anything, like Tenacity. There's one here in the Marauder Stort. These are hidden notables that won't appear in game. They'll only come from the anointment system. There's like 13 of them that only oils can create, and they won't show up on the tree unless you have them on your amulet. And this was one of them, and it is actually really good for the concept of our build because it has this Transfiguration of Mind. But this Transfiguration of Mind didn't used to have a name. It used to just literally be an affix that said increases and reductions to mana applied to damage at 30% of their value. Because it has a name now that the tree data is out, that usually implies that you can no longer stack it, right? You can't get this bonus twice. Kind of like how if you had Onslaught from one source and Onslaught from another, you don't get double Onslaught, right? You just get one instance of Onslaught. You can't stack them. And it's sort of the same case here. Because they've named it and they've categorized it as like one thing, we're not really going to be able to use Crusader anymore. We just sort of get Crusader for free over here. So what that means is we have to choose something else. And there really aren't any other hidden notables, I think, that are going to be super interesting for us. This one in particular seems awful. It's probably really easy to get. So at the top of my list right now is this Flash Freeze node, buried down here in the Ranger start. Well, in the Ranger area, I guess. We'd never be able to get access to this. And while the raw damage of it doesn't look very impressive, it's only a 2.7 damage node, and some of the other nodes I'm going to show you are much better than that. What it does have is 20% increased projectile speed and 10% increased effective chill. The projectile speed in particular is of importance, right? If you watch the previous build guide on Freezing Pulse, I kind of talk about Freezing Pulse as a projectile loses damage as it travels, right? It doesn't do the same damage at the end as it does near the start. It sheds damage sort of every frame, I guess you could say. So when you increase the projectile speed, it will reach targets faster, so it'll be at an earlier point in its travel by the time it hits them, so it's going to deal more damage. So not only is it sort of an abstract damage increase in that way, it's also just going to plain go farther. So you are going to hit monsters further away too, which is why projectile speed is just so core to Freezing Pulse as a skill. It's also the reason they put gobs of projectile speed on the quality, right? You get 3% projectile speed for every single point of quality, which is also why quality is so important for your own Freezing Pulse gem. So this node is one that I'm eyeing pretty closely and is probably my first choice. But there's also some other really good choices, right? Disciple the Slaughter down here is going to give you +1 minimum frenzy charges, which means that you will have a permanent frenzy charge at all times. It also gives you 5% increased damage per frenzy charge, so you'll always have, you know, another 5% damage. But it also has 5% chance to gain a frenzy charge on kill, which does work for us because it doesn't specify like you have to do the killing. I tested this and it seemed really inconsistent at generating charges, and I'm not certain why yet. But even if we just sort of toss that out and assume that you only ever had the minimum frenzy charge, as you can see, it'd still be a really good node. So this would be a pretty strong choice, I think, assuming it would also help your clear when it did proc and granted you even more frenzy charges. So outside of Flash Freeze, I feel like this would be right near the top of my list. In terms of like raw damage that has absolutely no utility like that, or caveats, it would just be like Throat Seeker and Heart Seeker. Heart Seeker is down here. They're both the same. They're both 30% crit strike multiplier. We already take Assassination, which is, I think, the best crit multi in the game as far as the passive tree. But both of these would be a nice, this is 6.7 in this setup. This would be really high. And Heart of Ice is another option. It's not quite as good as crit multi, at least while our diamond flasks are up. But this has 25% cold and 6% pen. So you're going to have to make this decision after the league starts and we get an idea of, you know, how hard is it to get Throat Seeker? Does that take 3 rare oils or like 1 common one and 2 sort of not common ones? I have a feeling that nodes like Heart of Ice and Throat Seeker are going to be in like the tier 2-ish category, where tier 1 is like the hardest to get. The hardest ones to get are definitely going to be stuff like Whispers of Doom, which allows you to apply an additional curse. This might not even be terrible for us, right? If you wanted to figure out how to jam another curse into your build, having Frostbite and Projectile Weakness would certainly be a lot of damage. It's just really finicky to try to fit a second curse into a build. But these are the kind of notables, and there's not very many of them in this game, that would are going to qualify as like T1. A couple of these hidden notables are crazy powerful too, and they're going to be super hard to acquire. But I have a feeling that stuff like Flash Freeze, this is a pretty specific kind of notable. It only affects projectiles, and only cold projectiles, really. This one will probably be in the tier 2 range-ish, I think. This one's a pretty powerful node, and I think Frenzy Charges can usually be utilized by just about anybody. So I expect most of those nodes, except for Flash Freeze, to be kind of hard to get, which I think makes this even more attractive. Now, if you wanted to get defense out of this anointing system, I would almost universally recommend this Soul of Steel for us. This grants a bunch of physical damage reduction, both through 5% flat physical damage reduction, and then 150 armor and 30% increased armor. So physical mitigation is definitely our worst defensive aspect. And getting, as you can see here, we get about 9% phys damage reduction out of this gear set, which is a lot, right? When we're only at 22, going up to 31 is a big deal. But it also grants +1 to all maximum elemental resistances, which accounts, turns into like 4% less damage taken from elements. So all told, the other reason that this is really good is because we are mind over matter, right? So the runner-up to this would be something like Constitution, which is the largest life notable in the game. But because we're mind over matter, anytime we increase our life, to get the full value out of that life, we have to make sure that we're covering it by our mana, right? We have to have enough mana to protect that life, basically. We don't want to be in a situation where we take a hit so hard that it almost kills us, because that means our mana would actually bottom out to 0 if we don't have enough mana to cover it. Which leaves you in a pretty precarious spot, right? For like at least half a second, you can't even flame dash or something. We never want that to happen to us. We want to actually die at the same time, or if not a little bit before we would actually hit 0 mana. So if you do wind up taking Constitution, you kind of have to play more mana ratio games and find more flat mana on gear, or maybe you even have to do something like back out of Lethal Assault so you can take a second mana notable. With Soul of Steel, we're getting defense through Rob Mitigation, which basically improves the value of both our life and our mana equally, which makes this a really valuable defensive layer for us. So that would be my #1 choice in that context. I think the only other thing I really wanted to talk about was modifications to this build. Obviously, we're still like a little over a day. I think it's like 1 day, 9 hours or 8 hours or something until leagues start. And it's very possible that I make further changes to this passive tree or something. But even as I'm sitting here, I can think of at least a couple ways that this might change. The first, and I think most obvious one from the patch notes, was there's a new support gem called Inspiration, and it's replacing the old reduced mana support. And what it does now is it still acts like a reduced mana gem. It's going to reduce the cost of the skills linked instead of being a mana multiplier. But what it'll also do is grant you something called an inspiration charge every time you spend mana with that skill that it's linked to. And you can stack up to 5 of these. And so every stack gives you 8% more elemental damage, and I think 10% increased critical strike chance. So when you have 5 inspiration charges, you have 40% more elemental damage and 50% increased critical strike chance. That's pretty good, right? The problem is that it kind of works like an inverse Arcane Surge. You get the charges immediately, but the gem keeps track of how much mana you spent with that skill too. And once you cross a threshold that goes up as the gem levels, just like Arcane Surge, as soon as you cross that threshold, it wipes your inspiration charges out, and you have to rebuild them. I think at level 20 they showed that it had a threshold of 800 mana. And that sounds like kind of a lot, but it's really not for us, right? Currently, our Freezing Pulse Totem costs 143 to drop in this scenario, because I've taken out the 9% reduced cost. You could get it back, of course, but I don't think it's really that ideal in this setup. Now, if you did switch, like let's say we took out, I think increased crit strikes is probably the candidate for this. At the higher end, you're gonna still want to replace Added Cold with Empower 4. It's an expensive swap, but it's definitely like a better gem. Increased crit strikes is the other like relatively weak gem in this setup. And if you did, let's say we replace this with reduced mana, right? Because I think it still reduces cost by the exact same value. We drop all the way down to 76 mana to drop a set of totems, which sounds like a great improvement, right? But if you think about how that gem works, we have to spend the mana 5 times to get to max charges. Dropping 5 sets of totems typically only happens in a couple situations, right? Like maybe at the start of a boss fight, or right as we walk into a map, right? We'll drop some totems to generate curses on ourselves through Soul Mantle or something. The problem is that 5 uses in, we're already at 375 mana basically, out of our 800, assuming we have a level 20 gem. We're almost halfway to the threshold, and we just got the charges built. So we only have like 8 more uses of totems before it wipes them out, and we have to rebuild them again. The real problem is going to come in sort of the gameplay loop during clearing, right? Because you don't drop totems that often while you're clearing. So you'll get like half of the map maybe before your inspiration charges drop, but it's going to take you a lot longer unless you intentionally sit there and rebuild the inspiration charges, which is like a mind-blowing waste of fucking time, right? It's defeating the whole point of trying to even increase your damage. So ultimately, like, totems are just one of the worst skill concepts to pair with this inspiration idea. What inspiration really wants is really cheap skills that are really fast. That's like the perfect use case scenario for this gem. Now, if we were like a self-cast Hierophant or something that had this 50% less mana cost of skills, and then we paired it with that, and we were doing some really fast self-casting, you know, ideally you'd build the charges really fast with like the skill would be really cheap. So the first 5 casts were only a tiny fraction of your 800 mana threshold. For us, it's just a huge mana cost, and we just don't cast frequently enough. That said, increased crit strikes is really not that powerful a gem, and if we were only getting, say, 66% uptime of 5 charges, it might still be worth running this. That's sort of just how you know, mediocre our choices are in terms of these last 2 support gems, really. Like, a lot of builds would laugh at getting something like, you know, 25% damage out of a support gem. So we'll have to see. It's something that I have to get into the league and play with, and I'm not going to recommend anybody else do it if I haven't done it myself. But it is something on the table. The other thing I wanted to talk about, and this came up in the build thread recently, was the concept of traps. Well, traps or mines, right? And this has been possible at 3.7 and earlier. I just don't have it in the build because I find it really obnoxious. But you can always try to rearrange your skills here a bit. For example, like merging your curse with cold snap, doing a curse on hit cold snap, and losing a lot of your sort of utility supports to make room for another gem setup that contains either like a trap connected to charge traps, the support gem that allows your traps to generate frenzy charges when they detonate. You won't really care how much damage the traps are doing, which they will do, because Ancestral Bond doesn't block you from doing damage with traps. Traps, just like totems, are not you, so that's fair enough. They just won't do any damage because, you know, you're a totem character. But they will generate frenzy charges. And so you can roughly keep most of your effects here. Like, you can still get Arcane Surge. You probably have to attach it to like Flame Dash, which I already find obnoxious. You probably have to do a curse on hit, Frostbite, or, you know, Prodigy Weakness attached to your Cold Snap. Also obnoxious. I've tried the trap setup before, and I just couldn't stand it. But for you, you know, you're not me, so maybe that sounds appealing to you, adding more like actions per second, I guess, to your gameplay for the exchange for, and you will get more damage out of it. You just have to deal with like more finicky curse application and this more finicky like chucking traps on the ground to get frenzy charges. Some people are totally into min-maxing in that context. It's not me, but it's definitely an option that you should keep in mind. The other one is just something, you know, like dropping this portal gem. You know, this is a total like utility slot. You don't even really need faster casting attached to Flame Dash anymore. So you could drop this for like a lightning golem. Lightning golems are another thing that I find absolutely obnoxious. I hate them. You won't catch me playing a Golemancer, that's for sure. But if you don't mind golems, there's no reason that you can't chuck a lightning golem into your build, right? The best thing you can do with any build, much less mine, is take it and fiddle with it and make it your own. So those are a couple options you can do to squeeze even more damage out of the build. I gotta say though, because of the changes in 3.8, that feels pretty unnecessary. Like, we're getting 15%, anywhere from 8 to 15% more damage out of the build on the easiest routes. And it was already crushing everything. So I don't know if it feels necessary, but if you like it and you like the idea of doing even more damage, you know, go for it. To touch on the high budget version of this build for a second, I'm not going to spend much time on it, but for the most part, you're still just dropping Sanctum of Thought for like a Jewel Socket and Pain Attunement so that you can run a Watcher's Eye and you can run Atziri's Reflection and Coward's Legacy for the low life effect. And you still switch your Flask. Not much changes there. it's still going to get roughly the same. You're going to lose the opportunity to get +1 cold skills on your shield, obviously, if you do this. So like the gap between this level of gear and switching into an Atziri's Reflection has definitely shrank a little bit. But it's, you know, the ceiling is still much higher, right? Towards the end, I had something like 6 million Shaper DPS in Legion, which I don't think you can really ever, you know, maybe. I just don't think you're really going to get there without Atziri's Reflection. So that still remains like the highest ceiling for this build, I think. But build-wise, nothing is really going to change. If you are switching to that, you're just stealing these points down here. You may wind up needing to move something like these 2 lethal assault points out, because there's 16% mana here. And even if you drop a Watcher's Eye, and you're only going to get up to 6% mana back from the Watcher's Eye, so you'll have 10% mana to account for. And if your mana ratio is already tight between your life and your mana, you may have to shed this little bit of damage for one of these, you know, Deep Thoughts or something. But it shouldn't really be any trouble. You're not going to be lacking for any damage if you're at the point where you're equipping things like Atziri's and a Watcher's Eye. So yeah, as usual, I've got the, you know, breakpoints down here in the bottom left when you're in Path of Building. You can use these to kind of chart a path while you're leveling. These go all the way through Uber Labyrinth and then up to level 95. This Path of Building link will be in the description of the video, as well as a link to Path of Building if you don't have it. And I will be updating. I already have the forum thread for this updated. It's going to see more changes over the next week or so, because right now I'm actually slamming into like a word limit on the forums. There's like a 50,000 character limit or something, and my build is apparently running into that limit. So I'm going to have to do some trimming somehow and squish the build down a little bit to make further changes. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to accomplish that yet, so if you're reading the forum guide in the future, please be patient with me as I figure out how the fuck to do that. Otherwise, I will be playing this as my league start, and I'll probably be doing like daily videos for the channel at the end of each day of the league, so that I can kind of explain in more detail how I've changed the build since the league launched, if I do it all, right? If we find out there's some unique items that wind up being, that's sort of what happened with Circle of Anguish in the Synthesis. We didn't know that ring existed, or at least I didn't, when I made the Holy Flame Totem build. And then it came out and I had to rearrange stuff. So if that happens, you know, I'll post about that in sort of the build diary thing that I'll be doing. I don't think we'll be playing Holy Flame Totem this league, but yeah. Blight starts in just over a day, so I'm excited, and hopefully I'll catch you guys on my Twitch channel or something. But until then, enjoy the build, and if you have any questions, you can put them in the comments, or you can drop them in the forum thread. I'll have a link to that in the description too. Peace, guys.